Do you have any problems, any issues? I will speak in Ukrainian. I could speak English, but it is better. I won't have any problems with the abbreviation. And my question is, do you have any problems and issues with the English translation? Do you have translation? Can you understand me? Yeah, okay, great. Okay, then we have contact. So now we have 1 hour and a half. We lost 5 minutes, so we are having 1 hour and 25 minutes. We are not going to have any presentation, so we are going to use the form of discussion. We are going to discuss and to debate. We are going about the topic, and if you have seen the topics and who monitored the topics, so the good topics and the changes of the topics, you see that we changed our topic. We started with the crisis of the activity of the international organizations in Ukraine, and now we changed the topic to the strengthening of the international presence in Ukraine, and the question is how can international actors contribute to reinstating peace in Ukraine. And we want to speak about what we are going to speak, what we are going to do and what we can do, and we are going to change from what we can see in the reality, and then what is the activity of the international organizations in Ukraine, and then we are going to speak about the perception of the Ukrainian society, how the Ukrainian society sees the activity of the international organization, and then we are going to debate and talk about the mandates of the international organizations in Ukraine, and afterwards we are going to talk about the actions which can be taken in order to improve such activity of international organization in Ukraine, or probably to stop the activity of the organizations in Ukraine. We also had such issues and such statements within the 2 days. So we are going to talk about the Ukrainian society and the European society today. We have 6 persons with us. There's also a colleague, Anna from Ukraine. She's online. So now, André Härtel is here. He is from SYP in Berlin. He is going to tell a little bit more about him. We have Andreas Wittkowsky. He is an analyst at ZIF in Germany, the Center of Peaceful Operations from Germany. Mila Leonova is there. She's from Caritas of Donetsk and Dnipro. She's going to talk about the activity of the Caritas organization and in the local aspect, and also Anthony Foreman, program manager for Europe in the South Caucasus Peaceful Change. Olga Kotiuk, she's also Korablyova. She's expert in security, social cohesion, and overcoming the consequences of armed conflicts. And my name is Hanna Homeniuk. I'm the moderator. I'm also a project manager of peaceful activities of Caritas in Ukraine, and I know also about the humanitarian services and the building services, and I will try to unite the moderation with my own contribution to this activity. So the greeting, and we tried to cover all topics, but you are free to talk about different topics. You can start with any subject, so who would like to start? So it's up to you, like at school. Who would like to start? I think Anthony is at my side. Probably he is going to start.
I think the first thing that is important to say, I think, is to react to some of the things that were said yesterday. And I think one of the things which perhaps needs to be emphasized is that the international community hasn't faced anything like this since the end of the previous war. I think that was implicit in a lot of the things that were said, but it wasn't absolutely expressly said that this is an international war. That was precisely the sort of thing that the present UN system was supposed to prevent. And what does that mean? It means that the practices that the international community has developed in the last 50 years, and some of them are extremely well developed and tested in all sorts of contexts and circumstances, have not been tested in this way, and require quite a lot of reflection, adaptation, innovation, but maybe reflection, I think, is the most important thing. I think for everybody who's at this conference, it's probably clear what's at stake in terms of the survival of the international system at all, or the continuation of the international norms which more or less hold things together. It's not necessarily clear to people outside in broader societies, and I think, you know, people like myself who are outside of Ukraine but try to be advocates for Ukraine probably feel that we've been involved in a lot of discussions that we really shouldn't be having. You know, it is quite clear, but it is important to continue making the argument. But you know, it's internationals who are coming into Ukraine with a set of practices in a new environment, have also, and you know, I'm not saying this in any kind of blaming sort of way, we can see how they may have damaged trust towards international communities more broadly through some of the things that happened. And we've heard some of the examples that were described yesterday. I'm sure everybody knows about the Amnesty International. There's some frustration about some of the statements of the Red Cross. There was frustrations about the way some agency of the UN system have been working, and so on. And one very hard fact that we have to say, you know, if you look at all of this context, is that a lot of these organizations have pretty much been working as should be expected, because this is a crisis of a completely different level that haven't worked. And I think that's quite a hard thing to hear. And you know, and you can say, well, if what you're saying is that the system doesn't work and therefore it needs to be torn down and rebuilt or something like that. But that's not what I'm saying at all. I think a frustrating thing to see from the outside, you know, is that some of these things that have damaged the standing of international agencies in Ukraine were at the same time actually also avoidable. We could see that, you know, if somebody comes in on a kind of autopilot and say, well, you know, we stand behind impartiality or neutrality or some aspect of that kind of word, you know, you can understand that when you're dealing with a kind of civil war or another type of international upheaval, you can more or less understand what that means. But when you're dealing with an international war, you know, well, neutrality with respect to what are we talking about? Neutrality with respect to the parties? That you can see how that can be very problematic. You can look at the principle of working together with local authorities, for example, as a basis for good practice, for sustainable impact, and so on. Well, so when you're talking about in occupied areas, does that mean we're talking about, you know, working in partnership with the occupying forces? Yeah, we can all understand how this is extremely problematic, to put it very, very lightly. What I wanted to kind of input into this general conversation is that there are also practices which I think are not as widely known as should be, that can kind of inject a corrective into this context. And I know that it's been in the discussion among international and national, probably more about national organizations in Ukraine since 2014, which is about conflict sensitivity. And I just wanted to make a couple of points about conflict sensitivity, because it's one of these things which seems to be instantly understandable, because the words are very simple. It's about being sensitive to conflict and responsive to these things. But actually, it's a little bit more complicated than that. And I think like a more consistent understanding of what we're talking about can help the environment in general. Number one, and I talk about this as a practice which has been established for 20 years, really, I think, since at least 2000. Number one, conflict sensitivity is for us, the internationals. It is not something that is an obligation, you can say, for Ukrainians. It is something that is developed as a practice that international organizations who are working in fragile contexts have to do. It's not some, this is quite well established in the agenda for aid effectiveness. Number two is, well, what does it mean have to do? Well, it is a practice. It's not like a characteristic of somebody. You can't talk, at least in this professional sense, of a specific person being conflict sensitive. We can talk about, a person can be politically sensitive or culturally sensitive or generally empathic, and all of that is important in order to implement conflict sensitivity. But conflict sensitivity is a set of practices which are consistently applied by an organization. So it's a commitment to a particular way of work. And going back to my previous point, if you're an international organization working in a fragile environment, you are obligated to do it. If you are a Ukrainian working in this context, you have an entitlement to demand it. That this is the certain way in which you should be working here because we're in a fragile, war-affected context. And finally, so you have to do it. What does it mean? And there's some very, very good practices. I won't go into the details of all of these things, but it does mean that everybody who is working in the environment has to have a good understanding of the various drivers of conflicts at the level at which they're working. Two, it means that every actor has to place themselves on that conflict map. That means that there has to be a priori an acknowledgement that you are part of this context and that you're not implementing some kind of intervention which is by definition benign and because you're meeting essential needs and all of these sorts of things. And all of these things can just come in. It has to be acknowledged your relationship to the people in this context. And number three, and what results to that is a risk analysis, which I think, nobody wants to hear about risk analysis. It's everybody's least favorite part, I think, of doing these things. But if you look at standard practice in development, a risk analysis normally looks at what are the risks to our activities? What is it that could happen that could stop us doing our project, which we have a contract for? Yeah. Well, a conflict sensitivity informed risk analysis is what are the risks that we pose to relations in the context in which we're working at. Okay, and that's putting it at a very simple basis, because there's lots of other things I think that were articulated yesterday about things that everybody knows on some very profound level about how we have to work, which is prioritizing local ownership, for example, and building relations between different groups. And I think these are all the sort of things that conflict sensitivity really can help you with. And the last very final point I want to make is that this does not create the solution to anything, because I think a conflict sensitivity analysis doesn't tell you what the answer is, but very often, and especially in a very vulnerable context, actually makes the dilemmas obvious. Because sometimes, there is no solution. Every choice has got its downsides as well. But it's important that everybody is making their choices with their eyes open. And sometimes donors don't want that. And I think I've been told that directly. And I say we've been running these conflict sensitivity things in lots of places. But, if you're put behind the question of, I can give you an example from Syria, where a community has had no assistance for 2 months. But some of the delivery agencies might be associated with jihadist groups and might steal some of the money. And then you're in danger of saying you're funding these jihadists. Quite literally, these are things. But I think that's what we're talking about. In the case of Ukraine, there might be other things which are different, but nevertheless, the international community is placed in front of dilemmas, and they need to be treated face on. And it's important for the international community to not give any doubt, I think, to Ukrainian people that this is in the interest, what we're doing is in the interest of Ukraine. But there are some very difficult decisions, and there are practices, there are reasons that things are done, and they can be quite difficult to explain, but it's very important to explain them, and there isn't a structure for doing that.
Дуже дякую. По суті, ми почали з того, що
Thank you. We started with
how extremely important and the prisma of sensitivity is. It's interesting. We started not from the international organizations, but we started from the issue how they should work in the context of Ukraine. We are collecting different themes now. Andrea, can you give your general report?
Thanks very much for the invitation. Does everybody hear me? Yeah. Okay. You need just to hold it a little bit like that. Yeah. Closer even. Okay. Good. Yeah. Thanks again for the invitation. I'm happy to be here to share my thoughts on this issue. I think when you read the title of the panel and the larger description, you're getting a very kind of critical and negative impression of international actors and international bodies work in Ukraine. And I think that is to some degree, of course, deserved. We're facing a major crisis, a war we didn't foresee, or an escalation we didn't foresee. And of course, international actors, all of them, the whole international community still has to ask itself the question, why we didn't foresee it and why we could not prevent it. Yeah? On the other hand, I'm personally more an expert on international organizations or intergovernmental organizations, so not so much for the ones who were or who are kind of in the focus of the critique, like you mentioned the International Red Cross or the Amnesty International, but I wouldn't even here throw out the kid, so to say, with the bath. Yeah. So I was just yesterday attending a talk in a ministry here in Berlin, and there was an architect from Lviv who was very much praising the International Red Cross for coming up in a very, very short time with lots of money for shelters and for new constructions, very unbureaucratic. So there are also those stories, yeah. And I think we are doing a big mistake. You were saying at the beginning that maybe some organizations even deserve to be thrown out of Ukraine, you know, for kind of overemphasizing those more symbolical and political kind of debates. I think if we look at the role of international organizations, and you already see where I'm coming from, right? In Ukraine, we have to get a little bit of the larger picture first. International organizations, sometimes I taught international relations for 5 years in Kiev, and I sometimes have the impression that this is not very well understood yet in Ukraine, is that they have very restricted mandates and that they depend on member state action, leadership, and unity, first of all. And unfortunately, the time of the 1990s, early 2000s, when we were talking about the actorness or agency, even in political science, I'm a political scientist, of international organizations, this era is simply over. I call it the era of perpetuate global governance. Yeah? Global governance was the paradigm we were speaking about back then. Now we're living in an era of re-sovereignization. And I've worked in some international organizations for some time, and I can really I was really myself astonished by how much sensitive every kind of employee there is to member states' interests in an everyday fashion, by the way. Nevertheless, multilateralism or the international community has found an answer to this governance gap. And we have seen that in Ukraine with the invention of minilateral fora, such as the Normandy format, and the presence of the G7 and the G20. They are a consequence of this crisis of the more traditional multilateralism. They are more flexible because they do not have a lot of member states or participant states, and they are less institutionalized. And they work not too badly. If you look at how the G7 works in Ukraine, I think it's very much praised for its role even before the escalation. As I said, Ukrainians have every right to criticize the OSCE or the UN for its role in the country. It is true that the global peace order has been unable to prevent what has happened. But by the way, and here I do not agree to you entirely, I don't think that the current structure was built for preventing wars like that. If you look empirically on the role of P5 states in international affairs, when they attacked another country they are veto powers. So if they attack another country, the UN system was mostly paralyzed in such instances. You can go back to Kosovo or Iraq. I do not have to come up with those examples. But here, in this case, it is questionable if this is really, if what has happened 24 February is really the fault of the lack of UN action or OSCE structures. It is Russia which chose to act against the UN Charter and OSCE principles. Under such circumstances, both organizations at least were able to act as forums for public ostracism of Russian action. Which happened, by the way, for 3 times, 3 different resolutions in the UN system since February 24. And this is very important. Yeah? It's very much underestimated in its effect. It basically motivated huge parts of the international community to come up with more help for Ukraine, those votes. In the Council of Europe, Russia was even expelled as a reaction to its aggression as a member, something which hasn't happened before. It also needs to be mentioned that, for example, the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission did very valuable work from 2014 to 2024 in the framework of its mandate. Who made the effort to actually read the reports of the mission could very well understand who was to blame for ceasefire violations and hybrid war activities. The mission was, from my point of view, a valuable cornerstone of the West's effort to stabilize Ukraine and give it time to reform the state, and the result of which we see right now. We also need to see that international organizations played a key role in reforming Ukraine behind the curtain of big politics between 2014 and 2022. I only mentioned the role of the Venice Commission of the Council of Europe in the sector of rule of law, the GIZ's work on the most successful reform until now, decentralization, or the UN's role in healthcare reform and overcoming the COVID crisis in Ukraine. Also, international organizations did not cease their activities after 24 February in Ukraine. The UN is very active on the ground with international personnel risking its life every day together with their Ukrainian partners. What can be done better? I think for now, I would be very cautious in overemphasizing the role of international bodies, maybe except of NATO, in regulating this crisis. As I said before, there is always, the international bodies can only be vehicles or extensions of member states' initiatives. And currently, this is where the problem lies. There is a problem, especially with European powers, in coming up with multilateral initiatives, believing in multilateral initiatives, and believing in multilateral bodies as such. If you ask me, German politicians have lost simply faith in the Council of Europe or in the OSCE as effective mechanisms. I think there's a clear understanding that Ukrainian security hinges most of all on US support, but multilateral organizations will have a bigger role once recovery can begin, but that is an issue by itself. I would not entirely, though, exclude ideas of future alternative multilateral fora providing some form of security guarantees for Ukraine. There was a lot of talk in the past of a new alliance between Poland, Ukraine, and the United Kingdom, or this is less talked about, but was talked about a lot between 14 and 22, a kind of a new intermare coalition or alliance. That seems far away right now, but it depends actually on persistent joint threat perceptions and the formation of new security communities in faith and action. And if I look at the Polish-Ukrainian relationship, something like that might be in the making, actually. I also, I can see you smiling already, but I also do not exclude a renewal of the Normandy format after the war, because I think, it didn't work, at least from 2019 on to 2022, but I think it worked well the first years. And without it, we would have seen a very much different security situation on the ground. But that takes a lot of initiative. And that currently, I do not see that initiative neither in Germany or in France. I don't think that the United Nations and the OSCE will see major reforms along the lines Ukrainians want. I do not see how Russian isolation, expulsion, withdrawal would serve Ukrainian security. What those organizations will need in order for them to play a role in peace building, confidence building measures is Russia actually seizing its maximalist position first. And that is a task the Ukrainian army is about to achieve already. After such a point in time, they have actually a lot of tools. So they would have to be reinvented if we actually kind of scrap the OSCE right now. The OSCE and its instruments, like the Vienna document of 2011, would have to be reinvented, actually. So there's no need, I guess, in dismantling them. What is needed is a change of policies in Moscow, or a defeat of the Russian army on the ground. Last but not least, the role of civil society and international organizations. That is also a long-standing issue in research and in practice. I guess it's a question, actually, from my point of view, of resources and political will. It is long understood that international organizations generally need to incorporate civil society on a much larger scale for the sake of their own legitimacy. That's maybe one of the most important gray zones where secretariats and like-minded states could do more in order to push bigger member states into action. For Ukraine specifically, I think that here it is critical for international bodies to understand the ambition of Ukrainian civil society in comparison to other civil society phenomena, national civil society phenomena in the region, to really play the role of a genuine actor who's not only there or wants only to evaluate things, give feedback, but wants to have a true role in the creation of a new form of statehood. Thank you for now.
Дуже дякую. Мені здається, ви зачепили
Thank you very much. I think you questioned and you talked about many aspects which are very interesting for our participants and where they have responses on. Probably if you do not mind, I would like to give the word to Andreas. I think Olga has also a lot of answers, but who would like to start as the first?
Можеш, звичайно. Тоді я передаю слово Олі.
Then Olga has the floor. And then Andreas and Mila
на десерт.
For later. Thank you very much.
To support the idea of Hanna to moderate this panel in Ukrainian. I would speak in English just to make translator's job easier, but that's a great move and takeaway from yesterday's panels to make Ukraine visible and normalize the use of Ukrainian language and somehow introduce us to the world. So I actually want to reflect to Anthony's and address points on the role of international organizations and community in peace building and stabilization of the crisis. And I would divide my speech into two parts. One boring academical theoretical, and second, I will be getting to bashing international organizations on a very practical level. So actually, a few words about me. I came from academia, researching, and actually worked a lot on the ground in peace building during 16, 17 years, and had a lot of experience with working with Donetsk, Lugansk Oblast, and also researching the issues of peace building. So on the theoretical level, I just want to step back and point out to that situation that we have now, where a lot of frustration came from, why we appeared in this point where a lot of Ukrainians and internationals frustrated on either side. So how do we understand peace building and development movement for the last 30 years? Actually, it came to the idea that warfare has changed, and since the collapse of Soviet Union and end of Cold War, Western academia and international organization took this position that we no longer involving in international conflicts and warfare has changed. We came to the era of asymmetric warfare, where a lot of secessionist movements and some sort of authoritarian oppression happens on the ground, and that's the problems that internationals have to deal with, actually. So the framework of peace building came to that point that we have to respond to the crisis on the ground that is rooted into the war dynamic, such as international, interethnic, religious, and other conflicts within like one society or different groups of societies. So we are no longer rebuilding international conflicts. And that's the, in my point of view, one of the root cause of frustration that now is happening in international community. So what we're experiencing now is like getting back to good old international intrastate conflict that is happening in Ukraine with a full-fledged Russian invasion and act of aggression. So the academia and internationals have to roll back and redefine what are we responding to. And I absolutely agree that there is no magic wand, actually, and international organizations, they cannot like stop the conflict. And at some point, I think that was the expectation of a huge number of Ukrainians that we need help, please come and stop this. That's where some claims and requests from Ukrainians to close the sky, which is for internationals may sound like very childish and ridiculous, but that claims and requests of Ukrainians, I think, came from the point where there was a lack of understanding of the mandate and responsibility of international community. And I think that we now at the position that a lot of population in conflict, in crisis, they usually I'm saying that now every Ukrainian is getting an MBA in conflict studies during this war in our own experience with a huge costs. And that's the second point where frustration came from, because a huge number of people just learning what are international organizations for, what is peace building, what is ICRC or UN, and actually here comes a lot of questions from people who were no professionals at this sphere, and now we have like built overnight experts in the international response, conflict studies, development, and actually war studies. Everyone in Ukraine now knows the very, very rigorous specification of missiles and very numerous names of MLRS and other multiple rocket launchers. So that's a huge expertise for internationals to deal with. And here comes a lot of questions. So, and huge number of people learned that there's ICRC. So what ICRC is doing and why people are donating a lot of money to that. So actually, it's like very basic questions from non-professionals in the sphere. For us who are working in that area for a long time, it may be very obvious, but that's the point when we have to reinvent and rethink how do we answer to those questions. And actually, international community now is answering to like very, very basic questions that Ukrainians ask. Right. And I would say that these answers are coming to reality, and a lot of frustration, like third point of the frustration, comes from the lack of understanding of context. We knew that all, that we have to build local ownership, build local peace and understanding of the conflict dynamics and like context that internationals are working with. But there was huge underestimation of Ukrainian institutions, the development of the democratic institution and infrastructure when the full-fledged invasion started. And we appeared at the point where the organization that hasn't working in Ukraine, they came to the scene and were actually applicating the tactics and practices that were relevant to, for example, some countries in Middle East or Sub-Saharan Africa. And I think it's very obvious, but I cannot like hide this, that there was a lack of understanding of local context, and actually that Ukraine has developed and built not ideal, but very good established and working governmental institutions, and as well as built social cohesion on a horizontal level to that extent that it like self-sufficient and very active and very resilient. And for example, there was like two types of international organization that who's been working in Ukraine for like last 8 years and somehow know what the capabilities of the country, what the capabilities and capacity of the civil society in Ukraine, and those who only came to country and like was doing their research and exploring Ukraine at the same as they were implementing activities. And that might be the point where internationals got the frustration. But I think there is an answer to that, and an answer will be understand the country you are working in, understand the level of development of civil society governmental institutions and a level of cooperation. And I think the good answer to what strategy should be taken by international organizations is let's evaluate the context and evaluate the challenges that we're facing on the ground, and not work on the sporadic level, but work more on the strategic level. So, and maybe instead of like bringing water to Vinnytsia region, international organizations can think how can they contribute to the long-term development of the strategies of recovery for Ukraine.
Дуже дякую. Дуже дякую.
Thank you very much. This aspect about the transfer and thinking about the prolonged programs. I understand that we are talking now about the action of the different organizations in the world, but also the actions of such organizations in Ukraine and the stabilization of this activity in Ukraine. There are a lot of needs, humanitarian needs and and developmental strategies. And this all directions are necessary. Not only the stabilization, but also the development are necessary aspects of the activity of such organizations, and also the restoration of Ukraine. So please, Andreas, you have a lot of subjects to talk about, but please start.
Do you hear me? Yeah, well, yeah, thank you for inviting me. As Hanna already said, I'm working for the Center of International Peace Operations here in Berlin. We are sort of, we're attached to the German government dealing with international peace operations of all kinds, but we are also sending civilian staff to peace operations that Germany basically provides as an in-kind contribution. I'm working in the relatively small analysis unit in that center, and my sort of regions are Ukraine and Southeastern Europe. I've been myself on mission, basically working for the UN in Kosovo for 7.5 years. So that's my practical background. So I will sort of zoom in on the question of international peace operations. If we come to that question, how can international actors contribute to reinstating peace and stabilizing the country? And let me maybe start with a somewhat sobering answer. I don't know. I don't know yet, I must say. And why is that so? That is so because very much will depend on the further outcome of the war and what we will have as preliminary states and possibly as end state of that war. That fairly much determines what international peace operations will be able to do there. When I talk to German audiences, sort of very often sort of the topic that I start with is expectations. I don't know how it is in Ukraine, but in Germany, sort of, if you talk about peace operations, the first thing that comes to mind of most people is blue helmets. Yeah. And of course, that it is a very typical type of peace operations that you have United Nations troops with blue helmets sort of somehow guarding a ceasefire agreement or a peace agreement, but it's by far not the only type of peace operations. You have a far range of peace operations. You have seen that in Ukraine already, where you had 3 peace operations in the last years, none of which had blue helmets on. You also have very different organizations sort of deploying peace operations. The UN is only one of those organizations, by the way, and I think you mentioned that before, an organization where Russia has veto, which is in the case of Ukraine particularly important. But you also have the OSCE, again, an organization where Russia has a veto, and that has become a very practical problem in the case of Ukraine. But you also have the European Union, but you also have, for instance, peace operations by NATO. Yeah, both in Kosovo, the fairly small Kosovo Protection Force, but also sort of in Afghanistan, the resolute support missions, were both NATO operations that sort of, because of their character and their international mandate, are considered peace operations. Yeah. But you also have peace operations that are solely civilian in type. All the operations that you had in Ukraine so far are civilian missions. You did not have any military missions yet. And so maybe sort of after sort of this initial sort of point on sort of the various types and scopes of missions, let me just sort of zoom in on what we had in Ukraine so far over the last years. There was one peace operation called the OSCE Project Coordination Unit. It's probably the one that sort of gained least international recognition, or it was a small office. They had projects ranging from demining to sort of constitutional support, but it's something what was called a peace operations according to our definitions. Unfortunately, this one, like most OSCE missions, needed to be prolonged. Sort of, they needed to renew the mandate in summer, and sort of that was killed by Russia's veto. So we don't have this as a peace operations anymore. The OSCE found a way to work around that. They found sort of interesting OSCE member states, sort of who were willing sort of to take over the projects, and the Polish chair of the OSCE appointed a special envoy, sort of who is running the operation. It's the same person that has been the head of mission so far. So that's one way of maybe you work around sort of vetoes and so on. The bigger mission that you're all aware of is, of course, the monitoring mission of the OSCE with sort of mandated 1,000 civilian staff. They were all civilian international staff, and then sort of some 500 Ukrainian staff in addition to that. And they had to be evacuated after February, after the attack, and they could also not be, that mandate could also not be renewed after March this year due to the Russian position. But to be honest, most of what the activities of that missions were sort of obsolete anyway. Yeah, sort of the mission, I mean, it was deployed sort of to monitor the situation all over Ukraine, but through the Minsk agreements, it got the mandate sort of to focus on the ceasefire in the east. And of course, there is no ceasefire to monitor anymore. But of course, you could think of a mission, be it OSCE or another one, that might monitor a ceasefire in future if there is a ceasefire, but only then. The third mission that you have been having in Ukraine is the European Union advisory mission on the reform of the security sector. It's also sort of a peace operation, sort of according to our definition, and that mission could simply continue its work, of course, with all the difficulties through evacuation, sort of, but sort of in principle, it could continue its work after February, because the mandate by the EU is not dependent on the Russian position. And you could also see sort of that this mission, and that was a political decision in the European Union, could change its mandate, adapting to the actual circumstances right now. That is, sort of, they got an additional task supporting the Ukrainian institutions in prosecuting international crimes, sort of war crimes. Yes, so if that is a new task for that missions. So the mandate changed, and the mission continues to work in Ukraine. And then, sort of, a final one. The European Union has now just installed a military assistance mission for Ukraine, which, quite unusual for European Union operations, is not sort of deployed to Ukraine, but works mainly in Poland and in Germany, sort of educating, assisting, sort of training Ukrainian soldiers, sort of for their resistance fight. Yeah, sort of that is a new type. But you see already in sort of the four that I mentioned are very, very different types of peace operations, and sort of with circumstances changing in Ukraine, one can think about additional types, but that really sort of depends on what we will find as an outcome. But it also depends, of course, on the political will, sort of the mandating institutions and of the capabilities of the mandating institutions. Yeah, one thing that I, for instance, can think of is, in addition to sort of missions that we have right now is, yes, in case there will be a ceasefire at some point or peace agreement, a monitoring mission might make sense again. We can also think of transitional presences of a mission, sort of in case sort of territories presently occupied by Russia are transferred under a political agreement, not sort of by fighting through fights, but sort of by political agreement at some stage, that you might have a preliminary presence by peace operations there, sort of that allows for an orderly transfer. Again, it's an option, but only if the conditions are right. One can think of a mission guarding and securing the area of the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, but that will be very, very difficult to achieve, sort of a mandate for such a mission, because that basically would require the agreement both of the Ukrainians and the Russians. You cannot fight your way there. But sort of these are things that you can creatively think over, again, if conditions are ripe for that. And I think at that point, I just leave it. Might give you sort of some stuff to discuss or to ask questions. But sort of, yeah, here we are. Thanks a lot for listening.
Да, дуже дякую. Put on you because I will resume a little. Да, бо хочеться трошки підвести тут.
I would like to summarize. It is a question mark, not a dot. What Andreas said and what Olga said, really, the existing institutions have many variants how they can act depending on the development of the situation. And it is important, first of all, to react to the circumstances. Secondly, to monitor the situation in Ukraine. Mandates were told and capabilities under the mandate. And I would like to speak about the practice, how on the ground the organizations are working together and the role of different UN structures in Ukraine. Mila can speak about it. She is in Dnipro in her office. I can recognize the office. Caritas Donetsk, which moved to Dnipro. Caritas, which was moved 2014 from Donetsk to Dnipro. We have numerous Caritas offices, for example, from Mariupol to Caucasus. Hello to everybody. It's a pleasure to join you, even if online. It's important for me. Thank you for the invitation. As Anna told you, I'm in Dnipro, and I'm a communication manager from the Caritas Donetsk, but in Dnipro. The life prepared me to see this war in such a way in Dnipro. If you look at the Dnipro Oblast, it is half-circling. You have Luhansk, Donetsk Oblast, Zaporizhia Oblast. At the beginning of the war, I had a possibility to go into a different country, but still I remained in Dnipro. Many people in Ukraine saved themselves helping others, and if you see how difficult other regions have, after we have seen the flow of refugees to us, it was the best thing to remain at place and to help. And the peace building activity by Caritas started from the very first day of the war. Everybody knew Caritas, Luhansk and Donetsk Oblast. After the first wave, a queue of hundreds and hundreds of people were in front of our office. The people needed elementary food, shelter, hygienic articles, and fundamental articles which they did not have. This queue, of course, conflicts arose in this queue because the resources were not enough. And we started with people as peace builders.
Міністерство закордонних справ Німеччини, а також миротворчі організації ПАКС, яка вже почала в Україні дію свою ще кілька років тому і підготувала досить велику кількість таких кризових спеціалістів, які почали працювати з перших днів війни тут і допомагати людям. Ми почали працювати елементарно, надавати людям підтримку, емпатію. Ми почали додавати людям ясності. Ми почали просто обіймати людей. І ці люди отримали разом з гуманітарною допомогою. Вони отримали.
And they started, so we did as well. I'm very thankful to the Minister of Foreign Affairs in Germany and other countries, and we started to help these people. Just sometimes to give them any support they needed. There were not only people who are just people, but it was a person who could get a start in our region, and we had a hope to change that we can change everything. In Dnipro, several months after the start of the war, there have been organized such hubs based on the basis of international organizations, and I must say that Dnipro didn't see so many international organizations in the whole days, and so many foreigners, how we can see it now. We also had an office of UN, the coordinative humanitarian mission in Dnipro, and we started to work to provide emergency help and very, very fast help, because people needed food and needed water and needed shelters. As for the international organizations, it was an absolutely new activity and new cooperation with Ukraine, because experts who came to Ukraine worked in Africa or in the Middle East before, and for such international organization it was very important to understand the context. It was very important to get the expertise, such an expertise, in order to set up the cooperations with local NGOs or with the state authorities. And Caritas was a reliable partner to set up such contacts. Starting with the first months of this war, we started to provide platforms and organize platforms where we united local organizations who started to provide help to the displaced persons. We just started to to give the context and to make acquainted the organization with each other, so they could be visible for each other, so that we do not duplicate the help which is has been provided already. We wanted also to share our resources we had, and so in such a way we just united united such things, and it's the work which is it was the same work like the UN organization OCHA is providing at the moment. That's why it was very important for this organization of the UN to have our experience and to learn our experience, to inform them about our Ukrainian reality. I had to the speakers before, and I understand that at the national level there are a lot of people who are not sufficient, and that the support is not sufficient, and that the cooperation is deficitary. Probably we would like to have something we would like to be more visible, but in the Dnipro region, if you are having talks, then you can change it. If you cooperate and if you go to this level of the talks, you can mutually change anything. And literally within the last months, together with the UN, we organized three events in such regions like Kharkiv region, Zaporizhia region. Yesterday I came from Zaporizhia, for example, and in Dnipro region. We show our organization the principles of the UN work with the principle of the cluster system. It is absolutely new for Ukraine. We also show the principles of neutrality and different humanitarian important aspects which were not known in Ukraine before. Probably we would be happy not to know them, but now we are in martial law and we in the worst state of war, and we need this help in order to get this financial support. We have to deal with such principles, and the UN is now doing not only the coordinative activity here locally, but also providing help via such partners like Caritas and other partners. We just show the organization, introduce organization to each other, and we try to do the new cohesion, to reach the new cohesion, and we are learning from each other a lot. As international partners, as we from the international partners learn a lot. Probably, which is mostly important for us, it's not only to be visible. One day before this conference, I watched the news in Russia, and I just wanted to know what the news are now in Russia and what Russians are writing about the war in Ukraine. And I saw this principle of the stereotypes. The Russian propaganda is working very well, especially for its own population. They say that we are Ukrainian Nazis, they are destroying us and killing us, and they do a kind of average of mass of our people, so that Russians think about something what is not a person, just a need. And it would be very, very important that we would like the international community to tell our individual concrete stories. For example, for me, I'm staying in Dnipro. I have a son who's 5, and I all the time see the airstrikes and I stay here under the airstrikes. And there are hundreds of thousands and millions of Ukrainians. We are living people, and we want to see more complicated than the stereotype which the Russian Federation tries to give us. We also, I'm very thankful to the international journalist community who is now also working here. It's our place in our region. For example, several days ago, a military photographer was working here. He came to Ukraine to show the live facts from Ukraine and to show the life itself in Ukraine. That's why, for me, it is probably very valuable that there is this cooperation, a lot of such cooperations, and there are a lot of international organizations who provide us funding, who give help, assistance to everybody who needs this help. On the Dnipro, there are 300,000 displaced persons. That is the official data. In Dnipro, in the city, there are about 50,000 of displaced persons. So the city grew very fast. It's increased. Now we have to build a new reality. The number of people increased. These people feel lost because they lost their housings. They lost their relatives, probably. They lost their previous life. That's why, together with the international organizations, we are now thinking about the fact how to not only to provide the humanitarian aid to these people, but also to support people psychologically, how we can bring them together, how we can people, how to make people to help themselves, coming out from the victim role to the adult person, to the state of an adult person, and not to be dependent on the humanitarian aid. These people should be people who should be able to set up a new life in a new city. Sure, they're going to get this support from the partners, but for us it is very important to see this, that they see these forces also in themselves. For us, it's very important that Ukraine is a strong country, and the country starts with these people. And in this war, we see a chance for us not only to restore the country, but also to restore ourselves, to rebuild ourselves as a nation, as a strong state. That's why these peaceful practices are very important for us, for building this cohesion, our cohesion. So, thank you very much. Or is there any resume at the very end? Thank you very much. Thank you, Mila, for sharing your experience and for practices, what is going on currently, and for the interactions. I also talked to the colleagues, and currently I have the meeting that OCHA and the humanitarian mission doing much more in the context of cooperation with organizations. So it is also a positive impact of this. And we also are speaking about the fact that the experience of Dnipro started, the cohesion started before the international organization came there in order to restart the cohesion. But this international experience, these international practices can also work, but only at the moment of the mutual development in the context of what is working in Ukraine, what is not working in Ukraine. We are going to talk about different examples. Today, we are going to speak about different examples. In Vinnytsia, the water supply, which not working, wheat, for example, providing food, not so. If people got not flour but wheat, so that then it was very difficult to do something. So we had such an experience in 2014. And cohesion, for the cohesion, it is very important. There should be cohesion between the humanitarian aid and political actions. Peace actions, which we talked about, between different actions of different institutions. It is really so in each government, each department thinks about only his task, for example, for military operations of the peaceful actions, but they not really have a link between each other. And so we understood at some point that it is the humanitarian help is helping the economy of Ukraine. It helps people to live and to stay alive and to get the things for life. But I like this statement, but the food heat is not going to stop the war. So that should be important. It's important to work with the consequences of the war. But what we have to more think about is the fact that we have to work with the war itself. And now we have a little bit of time for some questions or probably reactions on the comments of each other. So if you raise the hand and who starts, who the first, then the next one. So Olga, so we start who's the first, Katrina, and then we. Okay. Thank you. Then I give my micro to the next one.
Thank you very much. My name is Anastasia Zhuravel. I represent a European non-governmental organization for the protection of prisoners' rights. And during the speeches of the speakers, I have written a small speech of mine that I would like to present now because I have a very strong reaction to what has been discussed here today. And first, I would like to emphasize that I studied international law and I already had a lot of disappointment in some of the provisions and rules of how it works, but now we see in practice how far we are from the aspirations of those who founded the United Nations, the Council of Europe, and so on and so forth. But I would like to remind everyone that we have international law, which is the set of rules, including jus cogens and erga omnes, which cannot be violated. And if the state does it, then there should be responsibility for those violations. And if we say that we cannot adequately react to the violations of international law of the state, we as an international community, as international organizations and the states, if we are referring to our restricted mandates and lack of possibility and lack of empowerment, then probably we should reconsider the rules that are governing our international organizations. Maybe we should widen our mandates. Maybe we should reconsider international order to make impossible now and in future such violations, because we thought that after the Second World War, there would be at least a couple of decades, maybe forever, but not forever, unfortunately, some peace on the European continent. Now we see that this has not happened. And maybe we should reconsider once again what was wrong. Maybe we should work on the mistakes that have been done during all this period, because international organizations have proven their inability to implement the provisions that were once decided. Those provisions look very nice in theory, very nice on paper, but we also need strong action to implement those provisions, not just to declare them, because then this is not international law. That is like a fairy tale. And also, I would like to say that if we agree with the mediocrity in what concerns international crimes, in what concerns torture, deportations, if we agree that that can be happening in the 21st century on such a wide scale with genocidal intentions, then what does it tell about our own mandate? What does it tell about our own usefulness and effectiveness in reality? I would also like to say that definitely the emergency, the ad hoc initiatives, all the support that has been provided to Ukraine by international non-governmental and international intergovernmental organizations were of such a scale, and this cannot be neglected, definitely. And we are very thankful for everything that has been done. But we also understand that this, unfortunately, is not enough. But that is the direction in which we should go. And we should be more strong in our own demands to the Russian government, to all other governments as well. And we should continue in that direction and not go the opposite direction. We should not say that this has been like a specific case. This should be the rule. And from what we see, the support of the Ukrainian refugees and the resentment of the refugees of the previous waves in Europe, we realize that it was not enough for those people who were fleeing Syria and Afghanistan before. And we understand that this standard of support that has been given to Ukraine should be from now on the standard for support for all refugees. And this is how we should act as well on the European scene as well. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. As for the international law too.
Дуже дякую за ваш statement.
Thank you for your statement.
My name is Härtel. I work with Civil and Plus at the moment, but actually the majority of my career, almost like 10 years, I had been working with international institutions in Warsaw, in Kiev, between Kiev and Den Haag, you know, so so basically with that, I just want to mention that I kind of, you know, had been on both sides in a way, you know, and I see that specifically vis-a-vis this topic, there is no, of course, objective judgment, and a lot depends on where you come from. Yeah, so when we listen to some remarks of the civil society of yesterday, vis-a-vis work of international organizations, it's a one tone. Today's tone is a more balanced tone, and I also enjoy it a lot, you know, and the experts' explanations, and it also brings a lot to the understanding of the mandates, the restricted nature of the mandates. I mean, I may be not very popular among my civil society colleagues when I say this, yeah, even though I'm with them with all my heart, you know, with these critics of the international institutions and the responsiveness, etc. But I think there needs to be also a certain kind of expectation management also on the side of civil society and civil society actors and national authorities in Ukraine vis-a-vis this kind of operation, this modus operandi of international organizations, yeah, and this limited nature of the mandates, which is not necessarily a bad thing. It also makes international actors have an expertise, like, you know, like tailor an expertise and be able to concentrate and be impactful in maybe not hundreds of areas, but in something very specific, you know. And yeah, so I think this expectation management also on the side of civil society is very important. And it's even more important when you think about this enormous homework many of us will have to be engaged in when we talk about the recovery of Ukraine, reconstruction of Ukraine, modernization. This is not going to be possible only by civil society. This needs to be really like done in a synergy with international institutions, relying on international assistance. And I think in that way, civil society also needs to kind of, you know, be aware that despite the very limited mandates, how can international actors be beneficial for Ukraine, yes, and how can there be more stronger cooperation between civil society and international institutions. This is just my general comment, and then I would like to ask you, Andreas, because I really liked your concrete kind of ideas about different missions with different mandates by different institutions, what's possible. And you mentioned there several options, but after the ceasefire is established, and this is of course understandable, but do you think that there is a possibility to launch a mission even until the ceasefire is in place? I think this is also something that is at root kind of as a root cause for critiques of the current modus operandi of different international organizations, that there is not much impact onto kind of approximating the ceasefire, yeah? So do you think this is in any way possible by any of the international organizations, or some kind of a hybrid, you know, like, I don't know, military missions that could really like approximate the ceasefire? And also another question, considering the EU integration and the candidacy status of Ukraine, do you think there is a need for like an additional kind of EU mission or a more strengthened EU presence in Ukraine to support this kind of implementation of reforms and yeah, to support this kind of reform agenda as part of the EU accession? Thanks.
Дуже дякую. І саме цікаво, що це як
Thank you. It is a sort of a feedback to the previous speaker. We are running ahead. The harder your mandate is, the more stability you have in your structures. And it's important if you have understandable framework, but the more understandable framework you have, the more difficult it is to be flexible, and then you have genocide. And these are two realities which are from two different worlds. Andreas, it was a direct question to you. And after that, Ola.
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. Maybe I start with the second one, an additional EU mission to support reforms. I think the EU can support reforms in Ukraine through many ways, and it's not always a mission that is the answer. Yeah, sort of. I mean, you use peace operations only where it's really essential, sort of, to have a typical type of presence. And I mean, you see, sort of, there's the delegation, there's sort of this Ukrainian support group, and so on. So I don't think, sort of, to support reforms in Ukraine, sort of, that you would need an additional mission. You have one, sort of, to support the reforms of the security sector. I think, sort of, security sector is always very close, sort of, to hard security, hard government security. That's sort of why the EU decided to deploy a mission on that sector. Again, yeah, one could think, sort of, that the mandate of that mission sort of develops further, but that really depends on the needs on the ground. And I don't sort of want, sort of, to speculate and only say, sort of, for the sake of an argument, sort of, that you need another mandate. And it's something, sort of, that would probably need to come from Ukraine to say, sort of, we really, sort of, want to have more support in additional areas. And again, missions before ceasefire, very difficult. I mentioned that example, sort of, and again, I don't think it's likely, sort of, to get the mandate for that, but one could think of, sort of, creating a protection zone around the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant. That could well be, sort of, before a general ceasefire, but you would need to have a local ceasefire, sort of, to make that happen. There is a very, very rare type of international peace operations, sort of, military peace operations, sort of, that enforce, sort of, a ceasefire. But I think that is very unrealistic under the present conditions in Ukraine. You would need a decision of the Security Council for that, and you don't get it. It's the sad truth. I would completely agree with you. Yes, we need, sort of, to have more demands on the international legal system, but I think it's more, sort of, like, probably that you get there, sort of, in smaller steps in various areas. Sort of, there's not the grand design where you get what you wish. Yeah, very, very unfortunately, I think, sort of, your old president Kravchuk is right. Maimo Shamaimo.
Yeah, that's a great existential comment and quotation of our ex-president Kravchuk. Yeah, we have what we have, and that's actually a great sobering point. So we have to face the reality and the modality of work of the international institutions. And actually, my point, I want to get back to, like, very boring theoretical stuff. I think pretty much all of the panelists were talking about their own understanding of peace in terms of, like, peace building and peacekeeping operations and different, like, very precise missions. And I just want to frame it in this very academical and as well practical paradigm that we have, like, three different application of peace. So we have peace making, and that's a very challenging task for a translator to translate it into Ukrainian, because we don't have this like terminology in Ukrainian language, but internationally we use like peacemaking, peacekeeping, and peace building. So this is like trilateral essence of the peace, and it's like very chronological order in that. So peacemaking missions usually are launching during the conflict to make this peace agreement, to protect and to act on the ground and to establish the ceasefire and some sort of like stop of kinetic fighting. Peacekeeping missions usually go to protect what have been achieved, and peace building that a lot of practitioners in Ukraine are talking about usually goes after ceasefire, some sort of peace agreement or military defeat. So there should be like hard security established on the ground to talk about peace building. And I think today we talk more about, like Andreas talked about, like very precise peace keeping operation. And a lot of colleagues and people in the audience referred to peace building. And actually, I think at the end of our discussion, I want to point out to the elephant in the room and say that terminology and words that we are talking about, current Russian war in Ukraine, are very valuable, and actually peace become very triggering word to Ukrainians, and that's because of like history behind and 8 years of very not explicit narrative about war in Ukraine. Only now, at the 8th year of war, we achieved the point where international starts to call it out war and call the actually the precise terms. So I think that what international organizations on the different side of like for peace building, from peacekeeping, from like security sector can do is like listen to Ukrainians and be careful and conflict sensitive, and be careful about the words that we are talking about this war. And actually, I think it will be a good practice. So every new international organization come into Ukraine and start its activity in there will have a disclaimer that we recognize the Ukrainian ambition and goals in this war. And we don't want to put anyone at the table of negotiations, and we will let Ukrainians decide what the outcome of the war will be. And I think this will be a good place to start the work in Ukraine, to assist people to do what they do. And actually, like one last final point about your passionate comment about international rules and international law and rules of war. Actually, we have to face also the reality that the democratic global world is fighting and having trying to build some sort of relationship with a country that absolutely neglects international law and weaponized actually this international law. So that's the new reality we have to think about. There is no answer in my comment.
Дуже дякую. Ми наразі маємо 2 хвилини.
Thank you very much. These are 2 minutes after past 2. So I suggest that we speak 5 minutes more in order to finalize our discussion, because there are so many issues which were not answered. So I'm glad to give you the micro. Please. But I would like to ask you to be a little bit faster. Is it on? Yeah. Right button. Okay. Thank you very much. I think when we started the discussion, we didn't do the main thing, an introduction, that we have to distinguish clearly the humanitarian function, which is done by the international organizations, and the political function, which is also done by the international organizations. And my frustration regarding the activity of the international organization is in the non-fulfillment of their political function. What should I say? We saw Mariupol. It was an online broadcasting, killing people, and nobody could influence it, and it was horrible. Later, UN could not influence that Ukraine could evacuate people, the remaining people in the plant Azovstal. Then we saw Olenivka, where our prisoners of war were detained, and we've seen what happened. We do not know, and we do not have any access to it, and the UN cannot do anything. I also remind you of the grain transaction owing to Erdogan, and I think the part of the population in Asia and in Africa are also very thankful to Erdogan that they do not have any death, but they cannot thank the UN for it. These are all challenges. We've seen these challenges in Syria. The mechanisms are not functioning, the procedures are not functioning, so we have to change them. Do you understand that? We have to change them. If there are no alternatives today, that Russia has veto right in the Security Council of the UN, or has veto right in the OSCE, then there should be an alternative to it. I would be glad and would support that we should organize a military court, the permanent military court. It do not has to be called on for any case, for any concrete case, but it should be permanently there, because Ukraine is only one. That's why I would like to pay attention to this point. Thank you very much. You said very good words, which could be the beginning of our discussion today. I do not know whether there is a big effort to ask a question, to do a comment, because it is our lunchtime already. I see that Anthony would like to say something, André, but no. Then Anthony would be the last person who is speaking. So your comment.
Few points that I really like during this discussion from several speakers. One about making ourselves visible as a civil society organizations to find the synergy and actually like share the resources, and also look forward and not only focus on the humanitarian or this stabilization, but also looking towards the developmental role or the actual reconstruction. And I just want to bring up another sector of international organizations, international financial institutions, because the sums for rebuilding Ukraine is immense, and we as a civil society organization also need to participate in those processes as well. And we have right to do that. You know, the transparency is is crucial even in the time of war. So that is just like a comment from my side, that these processes are also happening, and if we want to rebuild back better, that's also another sector to have our eyes on.
Yes, thank you so much. Дякую дуже. Міло, ти нічого, якщо ми тобі не дамо слово, бо не маємо часу. Я тобі зрадала.
Mila, don't you mind if you do not give you the floor once more? This fine with you?
Не бачу, не чую реакції. Добре.
So I don't see any reaction, so then I give the floor to Anthony, and he will be the last person summarizing the discussion. But really, the civic society should do a lot, and it will be a big fighting because we are going to fight against our state actors.
Just make one point, which might be quite cross-cutting, is that I definitely, looking at systems is what we have to do. Also the development community as a sector, as a professional sector, it's about how can you build systems that sustain international peace, that allow sustainable development in a systematic way, so that you're not dependent on the goodwill of individual people. The system has to work, and what we've seen now is a collapse of the system. In any kind of planning, somebody could correct me, but I can't think of a system that sufficiently takes into account power inequalities in a way where the disempowered can have the voice which they have on paper in order to contribute to whatever it is. Okay, you can see the UN system actually gives more power to the biggest security actors and actually formalizes their already power inequality and allows them to legitimize what they're doing through that system. But it's very, very hard to find a system that will bring the small voice and bring it on the level with the other ones who, on paper should be equal in that discussion. I think, people do think of different structures about how you might do this, and some work better than others. But I think it's something, again, if we're talking about the relationship between internationals and Ukraine, it's just something that I would say is really, really important for internationals to think about. It is important to think of yourself as a partner and be aware that you actually possess the resources which are essential for the people to rebuild the country. I'm always quite embarrassed when I hear a presentation like somebody from Mila who would say, well, it's important to say thank you to all our donors, and sometimes it's written in our contracts. Your donors should be proud of the work that you're doing, in actual fact. They should thank you. And it's not thanks that you should be giving them feedback. Is it flexible enough? Is it sustained enough? Is it clearly enough defined into how it can be used? Is it appropriate to things? That's the relationship, because this is a partnership relationship for dealing with a very serious problem. I think I'll just leave it at that. Yeah, is that this is a partnership for dealing with this, and we can all see what's written down and how it should be. But there are power relations that the more powerful need to be aware of. When I'm talking to somebody, are they just telling me what I want to hear, in actual fact, or can I do both? So that's my closing word.
І тут тоді мої прямо заключні.
Then the close words. I see at the title of this session and think about the words we heard today from other participants, and there's some words are missing, and we are living in the world that one country is just laughing at the international law, and we speak about the international community and about Ukraine, and we have different ways to cooperate. Political cooperation. We are ready on the change of the mandate. So if you're going to change your mandate, so just invite us. We are ready to do that. Thank you very much